Hello and welcome to this OECD webinar with me, Duncan Crawford. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're discussing education inspectorates and asking how they can support the use of education research in schools. Education inspectorates play a crucial role in ensuring teaching quality, regulatory compliance, and continuous school improvement. But do they look at how schools use education research? Should they be doing so? And do inspectorates themselves use education research for their own work? Well, we're going to be getting the answers to those questions and much more with an expert panel of guests on this webinar. If you want to send them questions, then please do use the chat function at the bottom of your screens. First up, though, before we introduce our panel today, I am going to bring in OECD analyst François Starring, who's going to give an overview of some of the main aspects we should consider about this topic. Over to you, François.
Thank you very much, Duncan, and welcome from Paris to everybody joining us. It's a pleasure to have you all here. So my name is François Starring. I'm an analyst in the OECD's Evidence Web for Education and higher education policy teams. And in the higher education policy team, I lead the organization's work in the area of quality assurance. Obviously, as many of you will undoubtedly know, education research is really at the heart of what we do here at OECD. We try to analyze and examine education systems, the latest developments in what constitutes good quality teaching and learning, and we try to advise governments on those elements. But within the organization, we also have a specific team that looks into the questions of how can we make sure that education research gets used more effectively in both policy and research. And for the past 5 years, or even longer than that, we've actually done quite a bit of work already in that space. And I would say the latest things that we've done have been in 2021, a policy survey targeting really the highest levels of decision-making across education systems. And in that policy survey, we tried to really ask questions to governments to better understand who the main actors are in their systems that are engaging in the dissemination and production of education research in both policy and practice. And the findings of that policy survey, and also a lot of additional research that we supplemented to better understand the findings from that survey, were published in 2 publications: Who Cares About Using Education Research and Who Really Cares About Using Education Research. What we then did in 2023 is we did another survey, digging a little bit deeper into the different actors that engage in knowledge mobilization. So we targeted what we call knowledge intermediaries. So organizations or units or subunits within organizations that play a role in disseminating education research. And the findings of that survey were published in another publication around about 1 year ago, called Everybody Cares About Using Education Research Sometimes. So at the beginning of last year, so after the publication of that report, we thought, well, what else can we do and what next can we do to actually support countries in developing the production and dissemination of education research in a high quality way? So really increasing the impacts of knowledge mobilization. And so what we then thought, one of the things that we're actually doing now is then to dig a little bit deeper into different types of evidence intermediaries and looking at what is it that they are doing specifically and what works or what doesn't work in how they are disseminating education research. And so this slide basically shows you 8 broad types of evidence intermediary that we identified, or in which we sort of grouped them together. And then we thought, well, actually, which organizations are we going to start with to sort of examine that question? And first we thought, okay, let's begin with the organizations from whom we received most responses. And those are, perhaps not unexpectedly, research institutions, higher education institutions, and within higher education institutions, organizations for initial teacher training. So they play a very big role in knowledge mobilization. And so we published a paper on that in September of last year. And some of you who follow our webinars may remember that we had a discussion about some of the findings from that paper already. Second, group of intermediaries that we then wanted to look at was actually the other end of the spectrum, was the organizations for whom we received the least respondents, and that's actually quality assurance agencies and school inspectorates. And maybe that means that these organizations are less active in knowledge mobilization. Maybe it doesn't, because again, this survey is not necessarily representative of how active or less active organizations are, but it was something that we really wanted to look into. What is it that quality assurance agencies are doing in this space? So these are just some nice images to show you that these papers have been published and they're available online. So we invite you to go and look at them, read through them. And in the next few minutes, I just want to share with you a few findings from this second paper that we published in December on quality assurance agencies. And I just want to talk about three main messages. The first one is that we see that actually very few school inspectorates seem to include specific criteria or standards related to the quality of research use in schools, the quality of research used by school leaders and by teachers. And this is a question that we asked to our intermediaries that were targeted with the survey. So it's, of course, again, not representative, but it does give us an indication, and it led us to sort of look into a bit more detail as well into a sample of quality assurance agencies' inspection frameworks. And we looked into sort of which standards and how that research use criterion is indicated. So because there was a gap, we then also thought, okay, well, if we are to give perhaps some indications or recommendations to quality assurance agencies to tell them what they might possibly look at in schools, if we are to sort of look at how they use research, we came up with 7 broad standards and indicators. I won't run through all of these, but I suppose what might be relevant for a quality inspectorate to look at is to what extent do schools collaborate with external partners, for example, with universities, to really make sure that they get access to and use research? To what extent does a school offer time, space, and facilities to teachers to actually engage with research? Is there enough flexibility in curricula for teachers to bring in findings from research that they engage or access with? A few others are, for example, related to staff professional development or the recruitment or promotion of teaching staff. If we do a performance assessment of a teacher, do we actually ask the teacher in those assessments, what have you done in the past year in terms of accessing, engaging with research? Is that something that's integrated? And I guess another one, and that's a really particularly important one, I think here, is to what extent do schools collect and use data or feedback from their students, from their teachers, from parents about what works and doesn't work in teaching and learning? And do they use that data to actually inform school improvements? So these are just, I guess, a few ideas of elements that we think quality assurance agencies might usefully look at when they go and inspect schools. And just a little note here to say that, of course, those standards and indicators, we didn't just invent them, but we collaborated closely with researchers from Monash University in Australia who developed a quality use of research evidence framework. A lot of work has gone into that, and it's been really a pleasure to work with them. And so that's really how we developed this. Second key message, evaluating how schools use research is, of course, not the only thing that quality assurance agencies can do. In the survey, we also asked questions about, other types of knowledge mobilization activity that quality assurance agencies can do. And I suppose what we can see in very broad terms on this chart, so the dark colored bars represent the responses of quality assurance agencies, inspectorates, and the light colored ones represent responses from all other organization types. And in broad terms, I think what we can see is that it appears that quality assurance agencies are slightly less active in knowledge mobilization than other organizations, such as, for example, as I mentioned, higher education institutions or research organizations. But there are some areas where, they are doing something in this area. A lot of quality assurance agencies say that they do engage in knowledge mobilization. For example, they directly support policy organizations or governments by communicating what they see as key challenges or developments in education practice. And vice versa, some quality assurance agencies also directly offer school improvement support. So it goes to show that there are actually differences, and there is activity within that quality assurance space, but differences. And why do those differences exist? Why are some quality assurance agencies more active in knowledge mobilization than others? And I think this is really the third message of the paper, where we think that this really has something to do with the mandate and resources that inspectorates of education are given by governments. In some cases, there are just historical reasons, political reasons for which we decide it is perhaps not the role of quality assurance agencies to do knowledge mobilization and tell schools what research to use, whereas in other institutions, or systems, in fact, the rationale might be, yes, well, it actually is the role of quality assurance agencies. And so what we see is probably that there are three broad categories of quality inspectorates in terms of their mandate. And I think the first one is one where we say, as a quality assurance agency, your role is to carry out inspection only. Of course, as part of that, you might want to evaluate the quality of research, but also as an agency yourself, you want to make sure that your standards are informed and your practices are informed by research. You might want to foster peer learning among institutions, or you might want to inform policy. But perhaps that sort of direct link or support to practice, which maybe an agency with a more collaborative enhancement mandate might do, is maybe not something that we would want in that case an inspectorate with an inspection mandate only to have, because there might be a perception that we're becoming too close to what schools are doing when we shouldn't be telling them in too much detail what to do. And then perhaps another third mandate would be to really have a formal mandate for knowledge mobilization. And there are some quality assurance agencies or inspectorates that have such a mandate. And perhaps one thing to add as well here is that there are probably also different levels of intensity, again, in the extent to which a quality assurance agency will engage in knowledge mobilization or will use research itself. I mentioned earlier, it's important for schools to engage with data about the performance of students, feedback of teachers and parents. But quality assurance agencies themselves probably also want to make sure they really draw on the latest findings of research to be credible organizations when they come and do inspections in schools. But it's not to say that one mandate or one type of approach is better than another. I think there are always very valid reasons why an education inspectorate works in one way and not in another way. And I think that's really something that we are very interested in exploring with all the speakers here today. And for anything else that you want to learn about our work, I encourage you to scan the QR code and go look at our website on the Evidence Web for Education team's work. So thanks again, over to you, Duncan, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for those opening remarks, François. Very informative indeed. As François said, go to the OECD website. You'll be able to check out some of the reports. He was mentioning OECD.org. Thank you to everyone who is already sending in comments and a few questions already. Do please keep them coming. I think it's about time I do get on with this webinar and introduce our panelists, because they've been waiting very patiently indeed. So joining us on the panel discussion today, Ruth Shinoda, Chief Review Officer at New Zealand's Education Review Office. Thank you for joining us so late, Ruth, in the evening where you are. I believe it's gone 11 p.m., so very well done to you. Matthijs van den Berg, Director of Research in the Netherlands Inspectorate of Education, who's joining us at a much more reasonable hour in the daytime, as is Graeme Logan, Interim Chief Inspector of Education for Scotland. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us here today. To kick things off, Ruth Shinoda, if I can start with you. François obviously outlining the importance of education research in his presentation. How much, in your view, should education inspectorates care about research use in schools, and should inspectorates assess it?
I think that inspectorates are the only people who actually get into schools every day, up and down countries, in the classrooms. And so we are best placed to both understand how schools are using research, help schools use the right research, help schools find solutions rather than just identify problems. But also we can create research from our work in schools. So I think inspectorates have this golden opportunity from being in schools to use that to both look at the research that's used, but also create some new research.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Matthijs van den Berg from the Netherlands. I understand your system is very different to New Zealand's. Maybe explain to begin with to the audience how the system works in the Netherlands.
Yes, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Yes, I think it's good to take notice of the specific Dutch situation where there is a rather bounded role of the Inspectorate of Education. Because we have in our country constitutional freedom of education, which means that basically everyone can start a school based on any concept or philosophy, as long as they comply to some basic educational restrictions and requirements. And those requirements do not include anything like evidence use or evidence informed working, etc. So we as an inspectorate have a rather limited mandate aimed at enforcing those basic legal requirements for schools, and we have no formal mandate in enforcing evidence-informed working at the school level. Yes.
So just a quick follow-up, Matthijs. So in your system, do inspectorates at all play a role in encouraging schools to engage with research or not?
Well, not directly, not when we do research at the school level, but at the system level, yes, we publish an annual report, the state of education in the Netherlands, and there we do try to encourage evidence-informed education, and we try to encourage the use of research in the choices schools make, but that is an indirect role and not a direct role.
Understood. Okay, well, let's find out about the situation in Scotland. Graeme Logan joining us, who's Interim Chief Inspector of Education in Scotland. Graeme, what's the situation in Scotland, and what work is done to encourage schools to use research by inspectorates in Scotland?
Thank you, Duncan. Hello, colleagues. Good morning from Scotland. We very much encourage schools to take an evidence-based approach to improvement. And in Scotland, we have one shared framework for inspection and for school improvement. That's called How Good Is Our School? And that sets out a number of quality indicators. One of those is about self-evaluation for improvement. And that talks about and looks at ways in which schools use a variety of advice, evidence, research to reflect on current practice and indeed to evaluate any new initiatives, ideas and changes. So I think, like Ruth, there's a real opportunity for inspectorates to be both the producers and consumers of research and to use inquiry to challenge, take for granted beliefs, to refine professional judgment, and indeed to ensure that inspectorates themselves exemplify that reflective, evidence-informed practice that we would hope to see across education establishments. So in Scotland at the moment, we've had one integrated agency for inspection, improvement, curriculum. We're currently separating to have a new independent inspectorate, which is established in legislation. And we're looking at how we can ensure that the new inspectorate has a robust evidence, research and analysis function to support further improvement in Scotland.
Thank you so much for those remarks. So Ruth Shinoda, if I can bring you back in. If you're analysing the use of research in schools, how do you take a view on whether or not the schools are assessing, in your view, the right kinds of research? Because there's so much research out there. How are schools expected to decide what is the most effective research to act upon?
So I think Graeme put it more neatly, which is we don't go out and say to schools what research you're using. We set out based on the research, what quality practice in education is, the indicators, and we look at whether they're doing the things that the research, the meta-analysis that we draw on knows are the right things to do, where the evidence is robust. And then we ask, are you reflecting on your practice? Are you learning? Are you using your data? Are you using new evidence to check whether you're doing the right things? But the thing I love about the model in New Zealand is that we also, as well as when we've reviewed schools, inspected them, we don't just say what the problems are, but we give them some solutions. So when we do that, we give them good guides on you're trying to shift attendance. This is the most recent research we have produced, linking up with some of those big international meta-analysis, so that we're saying to them, if you're not sure what to do, or we don't think you're doing the right thing, we can point them to the direction of what the most recent up-to-date evidence is. Because each school by themselves can't always do that big analysis of what is the most up-to-date evidence in all the different areas of education. That's where inspectorates, I think, can play a key role as a mobiliser of bridging the very, very, very busy school principal and where the most recent evidence is.
Understood. There is a question from Gemma, who's just written this in, which relates to what we're talking about here, where she asks, do agencies evaluate the quality of the research before they think about its use? And if so, do they take into account the circumstances in which this body of research might be useful or whether it's not useful? Matthijs van den Berg, I don't know how that relates or not to your situation in the Netherlands in terms of evaluating the quality of research before potential recommendations about its use.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we don't do that ourselves, given our limited mandate, but we have a national knowledge institution which is separate from our inspectorate, and they do things like that. They have a task in summarizing evidence and classifying it, and also making the translation from the research to pieces of knowledge that can be used in practice at school level. So yes, we have an institution for this task, but we don't do it ourselves as inspectorate.
Understood. Thank you so much. Let's bring back in Graeme, Logan. How does your inspectorate connect schools to reliable research?
Thanks, Duncan. Well, I think we have an approach in Scotland where schools are very much empowered to choose the best approaches for the children in their care. So we'd be very much looking at the school's self-evaluation and the rationale for what they're doing, and is that appropriately informed by evidence, data, research. So we don't take a prescriptive approach, but we do very much have an important role in promoting good practice and in signposting and in working with others. So it's very much a broad national framework, and schools have a lot of freedom within that framework, but we'll be looking at the rationale, the basis for the improvement work we're doing, and what that was informed by, very much as the starting point for inspection. And that's been work in Scotland over a many years to develop that self-evaluation approach. And I see our former Senior Chief Inspector, Dr. Bill Maxwell, is on the webinar. So he very much led a lot of that work over many years, and it's well embedded. And I think as a new inspectorate, we're now looking at how can we make even greater use of research and analysis? And my colleague Fraser's, again on the webinar, has been doing some think pieces here, because we are really keen that we help to synthesize research and evidence to provide really high quality advice, and really help, I think, to plug that research, policy and practice gap that can exist.
Thank you so much for that. Inspectors obviously have a lot of work to do. Schools obviously have a lot of work to do. There's lots of different priorities. Ultimately, they're trying to improve learning outcomes. And there's a question here from Wendy from Nigeria, which I think is relevant to this discussion. She asks, how can inspectorates embed research use within inspection systems without adding burdens to schools? Ruth Shinoda from New Zealand, what's your thoughts on that? How do you avoid adding burdens to schools?
Yes, I think it's a great connection with the previous question, which is how do we ensure people are using the right research? So the way I see that we can play a key role is making it so easy for teachers and principals to do the right things. They don't even have to think about it as research. So we draw on two types of things. Just giving you a practical example. We use things, for example, from the Education Endowment Foundation UK, the big meta-analysis, and then we use our visits in schools to show what does that practice look like in New Zealand. And we package it up into a way that any school can pick it up and go, oh, that's what that looks like a classroom in New Zealand, because we collect real life examples, which makes it easy. And the other thing we do is we use our inspectorate reviews to collect first-hand evidence. We're lucky we get huge participation, so we can do some pretty good analysis. And for example, on attendance, rather than every principal and busy teacher thinking, am I going to be doing the right thing? Is this a burden on me? What we can do is show them from the evidence, here are the top 5 things that if you do them in a New Zealand context will drive the biggest difference on attendance. We know if you give your student a role and responsibility, for example, they're 5 times more likely to attend. So the answer is, if you package it up for schools and principals and teachers in our context, that it doesn't look like research, it doesn't feel like research, they don't think of it as a burden. They think of it as, here are some practical answers that are tested in New Zealand that might be based off international literature, but are real, that they can just pick up and do. It's a translation job, right?
Do you agree with that, Graeme, Logan? How Inspectorate should strike a balance between evaluating the use of research and not overburdening schools at the same time with additional requirements?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are very mindful of not adding to teacher workload, and that inspection activity is based on normal day-to-day practice in schools as well. And I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's in the chat as well about this idea of, if we sort of signpost what works, are we undermining local context? So I think rather than saying, what works and what will certainly work, we're interested in what works here and why, and what can others learn from it. So it's very much about looking at good practice, but looking at the context of the school. And as I say, coming back to that point about the school's own rationale for the evidence and research and data it's using around its own improvement journey. But yeah, it's something we have to be very mindful of, that we're not taking a prescriptive approach. We're not telling people what to do, but we want to be partners in improvement, and we want to signpost effective practice where we see it.
Yeah, there is lots of relevant questions in the chat, so forgive me in advance to everyone writing in. I won't be able to get through all your questions, but one here from Enver, which I'll throw this towards Matthijs, just so you know, Matthijs. So this question asked by Enver says, what mechanisms can education inspectorates introduce to ensure that research findings and feedback from school communities are systematically collected, analysed and translated into practical improvements in schools and for national education policies? Your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you very much. If I understand it correctly, the question is how the agencies can systematically collect experiences and wisdom from schools themselves. And well, I only can say how we try to do that. For instance, we are working on a new inspection framework in the Netherlands. And we prepared a very thorough process of listening to teachers, listening to school leaders, to governing boards, to take up all their experiences, all their feedback to make a better inspection framework. And well, this is not rather the quick way to do it, but I think it is the good way, because we need to improve our frameworks, to improve our methods by collecting those experiences and learning from it. I'm not sure if that also accounts for other agencies and inspectors, but for us, this is an example of how we try to work. And furthermore, I know, for instance, that our National Knowledge Agency, which is a separate institution, as I said, they have a mechanism where every individual school or individual teacher can ask any question or give any feedback concerning research, studies, evidence directly to a couple of experts, and they always get a personal reaction to that. And those answers are also published, so everyone can also use the answers of these kinds of evidence questions. So that's another way we try to involve and to incorporate individual teachers and school leaders.
Thanks so much for that. Following on from that, Ruth, Shinoda, what strategies do you recommend for inspectorates to use to assess research effectively, efficiently, without adding to the length of the inspection process, the intensity of the inspection process?
Yeah, really good question. I think, as Graeme was saying earlier, it has to just be embedded in how we do what we do. So for us, it's about you taking the evidence in the background and using that to drive what we look at, what areas of school practice do we look at, on what matters most, being really clear in our indicators about what good looks like. So there's no surprises. So schools know at the outset that we know what we're going to come and look at, and that is what good is. To explain when we look at those things, how good is it? And then to make recommendations which point the schools in the right direction. So it's so embedded in what we do, and particularly that self-evaluation part where we're asking them what research you draw on, that it therefore doesn't become an addition add-on. It just is part of what we do. I'm also going to be a little controversial, Duncan, and say one of the things we also keep an eye out for, which was in the chat, is making sure a little bit of research can occasionally be slightly dangerous in terms of schools can hear of pet ideas or people with particular views, and that when you produce it, it's not actually evidence-based. So what we're really looking at when we're doing our inspections is helping schools, making it just so easy to choose the robust, well-tested, multi-study, evidence-grounded in the local context, rather than sort of pet theories. So I think it's a really important role for inspectorates, because otherwise there's a risk that the latest fad or trend or ideas may come through as exciting, but won't actually be quality evidence.
Thank you for that. Yeah, lots of questions coming in the chat. Here's one from Evis, and I'll put this question to you, Graeme, Logan. Evis asks, how can educational inspectors make sure that school directors make the use of the research to improve the educational practices in the school that they direct? And what happens if they don't?
Thanks very much. I think it's a great question, and I agree with Ruth. I think it's about looking at the school self-evaluation, because I think good use of research. It's a relational, organizational, interpretive activity. It's not just taking one source of research and assuming that that's the right way to go. So very much in Scotland, our approach to teacher education is about using inquiry-based improvement and having that sense of criticality as a teacher to question and challenge practice, but also to question and challenge research and evidence and apply it to their own context. So I think we wouldn't look at just research in isolation. We would be looking at the school's rationale and basis for its own self-evaluation and improvement and what underpinned that. And as I say, we often see strong practice where there's that inquiry-based approach, where there is a sense of criticality. And as Ruth said, not just accepting, the sort of superficial or pet project type approach, but actually having that strong rationale and underpinning, and also looking at impact on learners, impact on the quality of learners' experience and their outcomes. So it would be part of that self-evaluation for improvement that we would engage with and be looking to evaluate.
You mentioned impact on learners. To come back just very briefly to impact on teachers, Matthijs van den Berg, teachers often complain about very heavy workloads. They've got loads of different priorities. There's overlapping programs, reforms, etc. They have to get their heads around. So how can inspectorates promote research engagement in a way that doesn't overload teachers?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question because you need to do that in a way that can be easily fitted in regular processes, etc., without assessing extra burden or something like that. And well, I agree with the other speakers that I think that the more reasonable way to do it is not to asking or enforcing schools to read all those individual papers or to balance themselves all those individual reviews, but that that schools should be helped with that by, for instance, the Inspectorate or any other agency in the knowledge translation, the knowledge brokering, so that it will be made easy for them. But I think it will also always be different between different schools because the local context differs, the specific question differs. So it will always be a local decision how a specific piece of evidence is or is not useful in this specific context. So those kinds of decisions, schools must make them themselves. And what is interesting in the Netherlands, they are talking about preparing a new legislation in which schools are obligated to work in an evidence-informed manner. And this is an open norm, not filling it in what that means, but just say, well, you should work in an evidence-informed manner. And I think it's for us as an inspector, it will be rather difficult how we are going to inspect on that open norm. And I think we will try to do that in a way that we will talk to schools about how they make their decisions. Can they explain the rationale of the choices that schools make? And I think that will be a good type of conversation in how evidence-informed working can be in place in our specific Dutch context. But maybe the other colleagues can add on that.
That's a good idea. Ruth, Shinoda, to get you to add on this. Obviously, he was just discussing their evidence-informed manner to go about these processes. How can inspectorates avoid pushing schools to produce paperwork evidence of research use, which could create extra workload?
100% agree. So that's why I'm back in the embedding land. I don't ask, or we don't ask about precisely your research use. What we say is, are you doing the practices that we know the research says are strong? Given that you've got to tailor it for your context, but at the heart of it, are you doing what we're expecting the research to show? And are you evaluating it as you go? And are you reflecting? Having those conversations, we're in schools, and this is back to my kind of passion, is inspectorates are the only people, at least in our context, who are in schools every day. And so we have such a golden opportunity when people are having conversations, when teachers are thinking about improvement, which is what they're thinking about when they're having an inspection or a review. You've got this window of opportunity to be able to help teachers and principals, not by adding burdens, but by making it easier for teachers and principals to do the best practice that we know will make the difference for the child. So at the heart of it, answering your question is I don't think it's helpful personally to go out and say, what research are you using? Is it the right research? I think the better way in is, what are the practices that we see you using? What are the practices in your school? And what are those based on? And then if they're aligned with what we know, that's great. Then they're clearly, it doesn't matter if they've looked at the research. What matters is that they're doing the right practices. And we need to help them find out what works for which kids in which contexts without having to sit down in their weekends and read through journals and journals.
Thank you so much for that. Graeme, Logan, if I can bring you back in, please. It's just a thought which occurred to me, and I don't know if you have the answer or not. So apologies if this is if you don't. Do you know if high-performing schools are more likely to use research? Do you have data on this?
It's a good question, Duncan. I mean, I think what we know is that high-performing schools often have very strong, robust self-evaluation and improvement planning. And of course, the use of research and data and evidence can be a key part of that self-evaluation and that rationale for improvement. And I think, when inspectors or indeed when schools evaluate quality, we always encourage them to look through sort of three lenses: direct observation, people's views, but also use of data, evidence, and so on. So I think it's not just looking at, do they use high-performing schools use research in isolation? It's how is that part of their own research, their own self-evaluation, and therefore they tend to have a stronger capacity for further improvement if they have that robust, evidence-informed approach to self-evaluation and improvement planning. And that's where I think inspectorates can be a real catalyst for systemic learning and improvement by engaging in that self-evaluation, by engaging in that really unique and privileged position of direct observation of learning and teaching that Ruth referred to as well. So it gives the inspectors that unique perspective to therefore inform policy advice by drawing on these different elements.
There's a question here from Nora who asks, going beyond schools, what can inspectorates do to inform education policy? Do inspectorates conduct rigorous research based on their own inspection data that can inform the policies? Maybe Ruth Shinoda, I throw this one your way.
Thanks. Yeah, that's the aim. We have two things we're trying to influence in the half of our organisation that looks at evidence. One is evidence into practice, and the other is evidence into policy. So to do that, we absolutely use our reviews and our inspections and the data from them, but we back it up by doing deep national dives into topics, like attendance, just as an obvious example, where we understand what lies behind the data, not only what is or isn't working in New Zealand, but why. Those deep dives, we survey students, parents, teachers across the country and match that up with our classroom observations. We go into schools and have a really good look. And we have such big data sets, we can do regressions and other things. And in doing that, we can absolutely inform ministers who we meet regularly about, from what we're seeing and the data and first-hand research we're creating, what is or isn't working. I think it's a critical role, again, just because we're the only people who are in the classroom all the time, which means we don't just have the data, but we can do the qualitative understanding of what's driving the data and explain it. So yes, it's here in New Zealand, a lot of the recent policy decisions have been made off the back of the inspectorate's research because it's real time.
Thank you for that. Matthijs van den Berg, I saw you nodding your head a lot to what Ruth was saying there. If you want to reflect, you can, but also a question for you.
Yes,
go for it.
Yeah, thank you. You saw that correctly. I agree with Ruth that inspectors also have this kind of task, and this is exactly what we can do, even in our limited mandate situation. So we try to learn from our inspections on the system level all the time, and giving the findings back to policy, back to schools and society. And for instance, in the context of high performing schools in relation to evidence use, well, we don't look at evidence use at the school level, but what we see in our data, for instance, is that those schools that have that can be called high performing because of they have good results or high levels of basic skills in the learners. We see that those schools all also have high scores on their quality culture, for instance, having a very well articulated plan, do, check, act cycles within their school. And well, if you consider that as a sort of a weak proxy of evidence-informed working, planning, doing, checking, acting, well, then we see indeed in our data a relation between something like evidence use on the one hand and high performance on the other hand.
Thank you for that. To follow on actually from Nora's question, it's basically the same question, but Graeme, Logan, your inspectorate in Scotland, do you look at all the inspection data that you collate and then carry out research on that data as a result of that, which can actually help inform policy decisions?
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, we, as a new inspector, are looking actively at the moment on what our function will be around analysis and synthesis of evidence and how we'll present that. So that's something we're actively looking at, how we'll take that forward. And I think the messages we're getting back from our consultation and engagement is people want very tailored, specific insights from inspection, whether that's subject-specific insights or to particular sectors, so whether it's early education, primary, secondary, and so on. So we're very much looking at that. And I think in Scotland, we have a Scottish research strategy for education, which attempts to highlight national research priorities based on data and evidence. So that at the moment is things like research into literacy and numeracy, health and well-being, employability skills, and that's to try and give a sense of direction to research activity, which the government's particularly interested in insights from at this particular point in time. So I think we do want to be an education which is data rich and evidence informed, and with teachers with that sense of criticality to inquire and be curious in their own setting at what would work best for their learners.
Thank you for that. And thank you to everyone still sending in their questions. I'm going to try and do a quick fire round, just to rattle through a load of questions. So it's going to be a bit sporadic. But Robert from Kenya is asking, how do inspectors address school non-compliance with policies and guidelines? How do you address school non-compliance? Who should I throw this to? Anyone going to throw their hand in the air? There you go, Ruth, over to you.
We look at it, we identify it, we report it, we require actions, and then we pass it to the different agency that then enforces it. Because at the heart of it, there are children there who need a quality education.
Thank you so much. Abi Bakr asks, in what ways can education inspectorates move beyond compliance monitoring to actively supporting schools? Matthijs, maybe throw that one your way.
Yes, well, to be honest, we do not move beyond that, and of course, there are other institutions who try to encourage schools to make use of all kinds of evidence, but we have no instruments or enforcement tools to go beyond that. So maybe the other speakers can add on this from their own experience, but we are rather limited in our mandate. So we do all kinds of things in the in the way of how to say it, reporting on the system level, but not on those individual school levels.
Understood. Graeme, Logan, then maybe you could give a different opinion on this in terms of how inspectorates can move beyond compliance monitoring to actively supporting schools.
Thanks. Yeah, I think our approach in Scotland has been very much about improvement, seeing inspection as a catalyst for improvement rather than a compliance mechanism. So it's very much around professional dialogue between inspectors and school staff, and to really promote that sense of improvement in the school. But where we were to identify an issue, let's say in something like safeguarding, that would be identified as an area for improvement and shared with the local education authority, who would have the responsibility for following that up. But our approach is not a sort of compliance checklist with lots of things that inspectors will look at and tick off. It's very much seeing inspection as, yes, evaluation, yes, public accountability and public reporting, but very much seeing inspection as something that promotes improvement in educational experiences and outcomes.
Thank you for that. Ruth, here's a question from Avaro for you, who asks, should we ask teachers only to do what research says or expect a reflective engagement with research?
Absolutely the latter. And it's all that balance, isn't it? You want people to be doing what the evidence says is good practice, but you also want innovation. You want teachers to be able to try things. And that's what we look at when we go into schools. Are you doing things which is evidence-based? And also, are you pushing and developing the evidence that is good for your setting? And that's where some of the richness in what teachers do sets.
Thank you so much. Matthijs, one more for you. This one is from Hamid, who has written in saying, can you share some good practices on how to combine findings from external school inspections and school self-assessments?
Well, yes. For instance, what we do, one of our tasks is to publish monitoring reports about the development of basic skills, for instance. And what we do in our feedbacks of those studies at the system level, we make specific feedback reports for the schools so they can compare the results of on a system level with their own results, and they can make, for instance, there the comparison and how do we score related to the benchmark or related to schools with sort of the same context or the same population, something like that. So that's an example of how we try to do that.
Thank you so much. Here's quite an interesting question, which has just popped in from Jose or Jose, forgive my pronunciation. And this is to all panelists. Jose writes, any inspectorate from a particular country that they admire or inspired by regarding the evidence use practices? Are there any other inspectorates other than the Netherlands, the New Zealand and Scotland inspectorates? Are there any others which you admire and are inspired by? Open question to whoever wants to answer it.
And all inspectorates are a bit things I have a kind of crush of admiration because they all do different elements well. So what I've learned is that you can always learn something from another jurisdiction, particularly in education. So those who are doing the really hardcore compliance, you are often really good at it. Those who are focusing on continuous improvement, like Scotland, are often got some really cool tools. So I think it's one of those things where you want to cherry pick or pick a mix from the different inspectorates.
Excellent. Anyone else want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. I agree with Ruth. I think, there's a lot of good collaboration and shared peer learning amongst inspectorates, for example, through the Standing International Conference of Inspectorates, SICI, where we get together, we share practices, share tools and frameworks and ideas. So we want the inspectorates to be learning organisations themselves and to model that. So I think, as Ruth says, there's things we can learn from each other across the different jurisdictions.
Thank you so much for that. I note the time that we're running close to the end, but Matthijs, go ahead. I can see you're urgently wanting to add to this conversation.
I will not. Just one small adding on what the former speakers said, and that is that I am inspired by the Flemish Inspectorate of Education, because what they do, besides all the other things, they also take a specific look at the burden of regulation, the burden of legislation, the burden of administration at the school level, and take that into account in their inspection. So we talked about the burden of assessing evidence, but there is a lot of administrative burden, and they incorporate that in their school visits. And I found that very inspiring. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much, and well done on the Flems. Well, as I said, we are running relatively low on time. I'm going to do a end of round question in a moment to end this webinar. But before that, I do want to bring back François Staring, the OECD's very own starring analyst of this webinar, who I think, François, I mean, your thoughts to sort of sum up what you've been learning and hearing about today, because obviously you're fascinated by this topic, you've written about this topic. What's the new standout things you've heard from this webinar, which really you want to reflect on and emphasize?
Thanks, Duncan, and thank you, Ruth, Matthijs, and Graeme. Yeah, it's been really nice, actually, and I think or hope it's been the same for everyone else joining the webinar. I'm really enjoying the conversation and I'm learning a lot. I mean, I was trying to like make a few key points here that I want to take away for myself, because this is the way I learn, because otherwise I might forget. And I think I want to maybe mention three things, because it's also just around a nice number to use. I think the first thing is probably that despite the fact that there are very different mandates across the three of your organizations, so for example, Matthijs, in the case of the Netherlands, you said it's very clear that you have a very restricted or limited mandate in terms of what you can tell schools or advise schools because of the freedom of education as a constitutional right. Whereas you have that, and then in New Zealand, Ruth, you have actually a very different mandate. You can be much more directive or direct in terms of telling schools what evidence to use. And I think in your case, Graeme, in Scotland, you were explaining that I think, you used to have those two mandates within the same organization, but then there was a decision to have a more clear separation between the inspection and improvement work, but still that those two go hand in hand. But despite those differences, I think, you're all in agreement that there is really a role for education inspectorates to support evidence use in schools or by schools, but also by policymakers. And that can be done in a direct way, for example, like where you do, Ruth, but in the case of the Netherlands, in a more indirect way by informing policymakers, right, through some thematic research or your state of education report. What I heard a lot about as well is sort of how do we then work with schools in a way that doesn't come across as being intrusive or directive, because I think it's very often the case, right? If someone tells you, you must do this, then I think you might be less likely to actually take this on board. And what I heard a lot is the word conversation, collaboration, and a relational approach in how we work with schools. That this is one of the ways in which we can get them to sort of take on board the evidence or what works in teaching and learning. Also packaging the research. I think you mentioned this, Ruth, to make sure it doesn't come across as research, making sure it's embedded in inspection frameworks so there are also no surprises, and adapting to local circumstances. So actually making sure schools see why a certain type of practice or approach or evidence is useful to their context. And then my third point is then related to, I think, how do we inform policy? What I found very interesting to hear was, that through the visits and the daily contact you have with schools as education inspectorates, you actually are the eyes and ears of the ministers, and that role that you can play or perhaps must play is incredibly important, and that there are different ways. Again, ministers also don't have time like schools to read lengthy research reports. So here again, there are different product or packaging work that needs to be done to make sure that ministers also are aware of what's happening into schools. And then maybe a final point, sorry, I'm making 4 points instead of 3, which is something that came up at the very end of the conversation. I think you mentioned it, Graeme, that quality assurance agencies themselves also need to be learning organizations and look at what other agencies are doing, and also I think use research in their work. Many other points, but just to say that I think it's been very, very interesting for me or for us as OECD to learn about your work. And thank you very much. Oh, I think you're muted, Graeme, Duncan.
Always good to end on a professional note. Thank you very much, François Harding. Really, François Starring, very kind of you to sum all that up for us. Listen, we are low on time, but a very quick fire question to our guests before I let them go. What is the biggest barrier preventing schools from using research, and how can inspectorates help schools overcome whatever that barrier is? Ruth, Shinoda, your thoughts first, please.
Biggest barrier is time. Very, very time poor teachers and principals. And the biggest thing we can do is make it super easy and save schools time.
Thank you so much. Matthijs van den Berg.
In our country, I think the biggest issue is that there may come new legislation asking schools to incorporate evidence-informed working. And for ourselves as an institutions, I think the biggest lesson is practice what you preach.
Excellent. And last but not least, Graeme, Logan.
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, I think accessibility, so making sure teachers and schools can access research in ways that helps them to think about practice. And as you said, they're not huge reports necessarily, but finding ways of making research accessible and relevant, and having aspects to it that help to challenge and inform practice and bridge that gap that can sometimes exist between research, policy and practice.
Excellent. Thank you so much to all our panelists today, and thank you for watching. You've been listening to Ruth Shinoda from New Zealand's Education Review Office, Matthijs Berg from the Netherlands Inspectorate of Education, and Graeme Logan, Interim Chief Inspector of Education for Scotland, and of course our very own François Starring from the OECD. If you want to learn more about everything we've been discussing, then get typing away and go to the OECD.org, the OECD website. You can check out the report, How Can Quality Assurance Agencies Support Research Use in Policy and Practice? And there's loads of other reports there as well if you want to feast your eyes on them. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for sending your questions and comments in. And thank you to Kevin Gillespie behind the scenes, who runs these webinars. They wouldn't happen without him. That's it for now, though. Please do join us again for another OECD webinar soon. All the best.